Young black boy saves his school. His heroic act becomes a national sensation. The world against him. The morning sun barely crept over the rooftops of the old brick houses in Meadow Ridge, a town that prided itself on tradition but often left progress behind. Elijah Johnson walked the uneven sidewalks toward Westbridge High, clutching his worn backpack. His sneakers, scuffed and frayed, whispered stories of long walks and countless obstacles. At 14 years old, Elijah carried a weight far heavier than the average teenager. He lived with his mother, Janine, in a two-bedroom apartment in the heart of Meadow Ridge's low-income district. His father, Marcus, had been incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit, a reality that was an unspoken truth among the Johnsons, but a scar Elijah bore deeply. Elijah had grown up watching his mother work double shifts at the local diner, her hands calloused and her eyes tired, but she never let him see her break. "Keep your head high, Eli," she often said. "The world may not always see you for who you are, but you've got to know your worth." At school, though, Elijah often felt invisible, or worse, singled out. Westbridge High was predominantly white, and despite the school's policies on equality, its culture often whispered otherwise. Elijah was one of the few black students in his grade, and his quiet nature made him an easy target. He was the kind of kid who slipped into the back of the classroom, avoided the cafeteria, and stayed out of the way. But no matter how much he tried to blend in, the bullies always found him. "Hey, Elijah," called Ryan Miller, one of the more notorious tormentors, as Elijah entered the hallway that morning. Ryan's voice dripped with mockery, and a small group of boys snickered behind him. "Got those math answers for me, or is that too much brain power for you?" Elijah clenched his jaw and kept walking, his heart pounding. He knew better than to engage. Experience had taught him that standing up for himself would only escalate the situation. As he passed, Ryan muttered something under his breath, something Elijah chose to block out. But the sting of the moment lingered, like so many others before it. In class, the atmosphere wasn't much better. Teachers rarely called on Elijah, and when they did, it often felt like they were testing him, waiting for him to falter. That day, Mrs. Donovan, his history teacher, asked him to explain a concept they'd covered the day before. He answered correctly, but she responded with a curt, lucky guess. The chuckles from the back of the room cut through him like a blade. The pattern was as predictable as it was exhausting. The microaggressions, the outright bullying, the constant feeling of having to prove himself, it all left Elijah drained, but he never let it show. He held his head high, just as his mother had taught him, even when his confidence wavered. That afternoon, as Elijah headed to his usual spot in the library, he overheard something that made his stomach drop. Two students were huddled near the stairwell, their voices low but urgent. "Did you get it?" one asked. "Yeah, it's all set. Assembly tomorrow. Nobody's gonna know what hit him," the other replied with a smirk. Elijah paused, pretending to tie his shoe as he strained to hear more. The words were vague, but the tone unmistakable. Something wasn't right. His mind raced. What could they be planning? What could they be planning? A prank? Something worse? The thought of a threat to his school, a place that already felt unsafe for him, sent a chill down his spine. Elijah wrestled with what to do. He could report what he'd heard, but would anyone listen? Would they take him seriously, or would they dismiss him as they so often did? He thought of Ryan's taunts, of Mrs. Donovan's condescending tone, of all the times he'd felt unseen and unheard. As he walked home that evening, Elijah's thoughts grew heavier. The familiar streets felt darker, the weight on his shoulders pressing harder. He thought of his father, who had always told him to do the right thing, even when it was hard. "Courage isn't about being fearless, son," Marcus had once said during a rare phone call from prison. "It's about standing tall, even when the world wants you to kneel." That night, Elijah sat at the small kitchen table, his homework spread before him. His mother bustled around preparing dinner after her long shift. She noticed his furrowed brow and paused, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Something on your mind, baby?" she asked, her voice soft. Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. "Just school stuff," he muttered. Janine studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his. "You're a thinker, Eli. Don't let that mind of yours carry too much weight on its own. Sometimes sharing what's in here," she tapped his temple, "helps lighten the load." Elijah nodded, but stayed silent. He didn't want to worry her, not after everything she already carried. Instead, he went to bed that night with his mind churning. The fragments of the conversation he'd overheard replayed over and over, the sense of foreboding growing stronger. The next day at school, Elijah's unease only deepened. The assembly was scheduled for the afternoon, and the atmosphere felt charged in a way he couldn't explain. He tried to focus in class, but his mind kept drifting back to the stairwell, to the smirks and whispers. He knew he had to do something, but what? As the time for the assembly approached, Elijah made a decision. He couldn't stay silent. Even if no one believed him, even if they dismissed him or mocked him, he had to try. He approached the principal's office, his heart pounding like a drum. Inside, Principal Carter looked up from his desk, his expression one of mild surprise. "Elijah, what can I do for you?" Elijah swallowed hard, his palms slick with sweat. I overheard something yesterday," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "I think someone might be planning something dangerous for the assembly." Principal Carter's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Elijah thought he saw a flicker of concern. But then the principal leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to skepticism. "Do you have any proof?" he asked. Elijah shook his head. "No, but..." "Without evidence, it's hard to take action," Principal Carter interrupted. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Elijah, but we can't jump to conclusions." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He left the office feeling deflated, but his resolve only grew stronger. If the adults wouldn't listen, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. He didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stand by and do nothing. As he walked toward the auditorium, the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than ever. But deep down, a spark of determination began to ignite. Elijah Johnson might have been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, but he was about to prove just how much one voice, one act, could change everything. Rising tensions. The auditorium hummed with the chatter of students as they filed in for the assembly. The polished wood floors reflected the bright stage lights, and the massive red curtain swayed slightly, concealing the podium behind it. The event was routine, another presentation by the principal and guest speakers, but Elijah felt anything but routine about this day. He sat in the middle row, his heart pounding like a drum. As the principal gave the usual opening remarks, Elijah scanned the room. The two students he had overheard near the stairwell were sitting 3 rows ahead, whispering and glancing around suspiciously. Their demeanor sent an icy chill down his spine. Something was definitely off. A weighty decision. Elijah's mind was racing. He'd already tried to warn Principal Carter, and it had gone nowhere. He thought about approaching one of the teachers seated near the stage, but doubt clouded his resolve. Would they even believe him? They rarely looked his way unless it was to scold him for being late or for not bringing the right supplies. What if he was wrong? What if it was just some dumb prank and not the serious danger he feared? The consequences of making a false alarm felt overwhelming. But another voice in his head, one that sounded a lot like his father's, pushed him to think of the what-ifs in the opposite direction. What if he stayed silent and something horrible happened? Signs of trouble. As the guest speaker took the stage, Elijah's unease deepened. He noticed one of the boys from the stairwell subtly slipping something out of his backpack. Elijah couldn't see exactly what it was, but the quick, deliberate motion sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. His breath caught as he leaned forward, trying to get a clearer view. That's when Ryan Miller, sitting a few seats away, smirked and leaned over. "What's the matter, Johnson? Scared of a little school assembly?" Ryan's voice was barely above a whisper, but the mockery in it was sharp. Elijah ignored him, keeping his eyes locked on the two boys. Ryan's voice faded into the background as Elijah's senses sharpened. He noticed one of the boys subtly nudging the other and pointing toward the far side of the room near the fire exit. A strange exchange passed between them. A nod, a gesture, and then a shared grin. Elijah's chest tightened. He wasn't imagining this. Something was about to happen. Taking action. Time was running out. Elijah had no idea what the two boys were planning, but he couldn't sit back and wait to find out. His fingers clenched around the edge of his seat as he made a decision. If no one else was going to act, he would. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, earning a few curious glances from the students around him. Ignoring them, Elijah made his way to the edge of the row and quietly slipped out of the auditorium. The hallways were eerily quiet, the distant echo of the assembly's proceedings reverberating through the walls. Elijah headed straight for the security office, his sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floors. He prayed silently that someone would listen to him this time. When he reached the office, he found Mr. Harris, the head of school security, scrolling through his phone. The man barely glanced up when Elijah entered. "What's up, kid?" Harris asked, sounding more annoyed than concerned. Elijah hesitated for a moment, then blurted out, "I think something bad is about to happen in the auditorium. I overheard 2 students planning something yesterday, and they're acting really suspicious right now." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any proof?" "I don't, but..." "Listen," Harris interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "Kids talk all the time. Pranks, jokes, rumors. It's part of the deal. I can't go disrupting an assembly over hearsay." Elijah's frustration boiled over. What if it's not just a prank? What if someone gets hurt? Are you really going to risk that? Harris sighed, his skepticism softening slightly at the urgency in Elijah's voice. "Fine," he said, standing up and grabbing his radio. "I'll take a look, but if this turns out to be nothing, you're going to owe me an explanation." The unfolding threat. Elijah led Harris back toward the auditorium, his stomach in knots. As they approached the doors, the muffled sound of the assembly filled the air. Harris motioned for Elijah to stay back while he entered the room, scanning the crowd for signs of trouble. Elijah waited anxiously in the hallway, every second stretching into an eternity. He peered through the small window in the door, watching as Harris made his way down the aisle, his eyes darting toward the 2 boys Elijah had pointed out. Just as Harris reached the row where the boys were seated, one of them stood up abruptly. Elijah's heart dropped as he saw the boy pull something from his backpack, something small but unmistakably dangerous. A canister. Chaos erupts. Before Elijah could process what was happening, the boy threw the canister toward the stage. Smoke erupted from it, filling the air with a thick, choking fog. Screams echoed through the auditorium as students scrambled to their feet, panicking. Harris immediately sprang into action, shouting orders into his radio and moving to intercept the second boy, who had started to make his way toward the fire exit. Elijah didn't think, he just acted. He pushed open the auditorium doors and ran inside, the chaos engulfing him. His lungs burned as he inhaled the acrid smoke, but he didn't stop. He spotted the first boy near the stage, fumbling with another item in his bag. Without hesitation, Elijah rushed forward and tackled him to the ground, knocking the bag out of his hands. The impact sent both of them sprawling, but Elijah scrambled to his feet, grabbing the bag and hurling it away. The boy glared at him, rage twisting his face. "Stay out of this," he snarled, but Elijah stood his ground, his heart pounding like a drum. The aftermath. By the time the smoke cleared, Harris and a few other staff members had restrained both boys. The auditorium was in disarray, but the danger had been neutralized. Students coughed and wiped their eyes, some crying, others consoling one another. Elijah stood near the stage, his hands trembling as the adrenaline wore off. For a moment, everything was silent. Then a single voice called out, "It was Elijah!" He stopped them. The words spread like wildfire, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Elijah felt every eye in the room turn toward him, their gazes a mix of shock, gratitude, and disbelief. Principal Carter approached him, his face pale but his expression sincere. "Elijah," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I think you just saved a lot of lives today." Elijah nodded, his throat tight with emotion. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel invisible. A hero under scrutiny. The smoke had barely cleared, but the whispers in the aftermath were deafening. Students gathered in tight groups in the hallways, recounting the chaos, their voices filled with a mix of fear and awe. Teachers escorted trembling students to the nurse's office while the rest tried to restore order. Elijah Johnson sat in the principal's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His adrenaline had waned, replaced by an overwhelming wave of uncertainty. Across the desk, Principal Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression a complicated mix of gratitude and concern. Next to him sat Mr. Harris, the head of security, who was still catching his breath after helping to subdue the 2 students responsible for the attack. Elijah, Principal Carter began, his voice measured. What you did today, it was brave. Incredibly brave. You might have saved lives. Elijah nodded, his throat too dry to speak. His hands were trembling, but he clenched them tighter to keep them still. However, Carter continued, I need to understand exactly how you knew something was going to happen. Walk us through what led to this. Elijah hesitated, glancing between Carter and Harris. He felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. I overheard them yesterday, Elijah said finally, his voice steady but low. They were talking near the stairwell about something happening during the assembly. They didn't say exactly what, but the way they were talking, it didn't feel right. Principal Carter raised an eyebrow. Why didn't you come to me immediately? I did, Elijah replied, the words escaping before he could stop them. But you didn't believe me. Carter stiffened, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Harris cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing away. Well, Carter said after a long pause, it seems you took matters into your own hands. I'm not sure whether to commend you or reprimand you for that, but given the outcome, I think we can all agree it was the right call. Harris leaned forward. You could have been seriously hurt, Elijah. Do you understand that? What you did was reckless. It was necessary, Elijah said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. If I hadn't done something, who knows what could have happened? Harris sighed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Carter, who nodded slightly. By the time Elijah left the office, the school was buzzing with activity. Police officers had arrived to take statements from witnesses, and the 2 students responsible for the attack were in custody. Word spread quickly about Elijah's role in stopping the incident, and as he walked through the hallways, students stared at him with a mix of curiosity and admiration. Elijah, you're a hero, someone called out, but the words felt foreign to him. He had spent so long trying to go unnoticed that the sudden attention was almost unbearable. Ryan Miller, however, had a different reaction. As Elijah passed him in the hallway, Ryan smirked and muttered under his breath, Guess even a broken clock is right twice a day. Elijah ignored him, but the sting of Ryan's words lingered. Even in the face of his bravery, there were still those who refused to see him for who he truly was. The media storm. By the end of the day, the story had already reached local news outlets. Reporters camped outside the school, their cameras trained on students as they left. Elijah ducked his head, trying to avoid the flashing lights, but one reporter spotted him. Elijah Johnson, she called out, rushing toward him. You're the boy who stopped the attack, right? Can you tell us what was going through your mind? Caught off guard, Elijah froze. His mother, who had arrived to pick him up after hearing about the incident, stepped in quickly. No comment, Janine said firmly, placing a protective hand on Elijah's shoulder and guiding him toward the car. As they drove home, Janine kept glancing at Elijah, her face a mixture of worry and pride. Baby, you did something incredible today, she said softly. But this attention, it's going to be a lot. Are you ready for that? Elijah shrugged, staring out the window. I didn't do it for attention, Mom. I just didn't want anyone to get hurt. I know, Janine said, but the world doesn't always see things the way we do. You've put yourself in the spotlight now, and not everyone's going to be kind about it. Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the challenges Elijah would face even in the wake of his heroism. A mixed response. The next morning, Elijah woke to find his name plastered across headlines. Teen hero prevents potential school tragedy. Quiet black student saves the day. While many praised him, the darker side of the internet reared its head. Anonymous commenters questioned his motives, some even accusing him of being involved in the plot. Others used the incident as an excuse to spout racist rhetoric, reducing his bravery to a mere stereotype. Janine tried to shield Elijah from the worst of it, but he couldn't avoid the whispers at school. Some students looked at him with newfound respect, while others regarded him with suspicion or envy. Don't let them get to you, his best friend Malik said during lunch. Malik, one of the few other black students at Westbridge, had always been fiercely loyal. They're just mad because they could never do what you did. Elijah nodded, but the weight of the scrutiny was hard to ignore. A glimmer of hope. Despite the mixed reactions, there were moments of genuine warmth. One day, as Elijah was leaving class, a teacher stopped him in the hallway. "Elijah," Mr. Patel said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. What you did took real courage." Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat. It was one of the few times a teacher had acknowledged him in a positive light. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his mother, trying to process everything. "You've got a choice to make, Eli," Janine said. "You can let the negativity drag you down, or you can rise above it. Show them who you really are." Her words struck a chord. For the first time, Elijah realized that his actions had given him a platform, a chance to be heard in a way he never had before. The invitation. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was crisp and official looking, with the presidential seal embossed on the corner. Elijah stared at it in disbelief before tearing it open. Inside was a personal letter from the President of the United States, commending Elijah for his bravery and inviting him to the White House to be recognized for his actions. Elijah's hands shook as he read the words aloud to his mother. Janine's eyes filled with tears, her pride shining through. "This is it, Eli," she said. "This is your moment." Elijah nodded, a sense of determination settling over him. He had faced hatred, doubt, and adversity, but he had also proven to himself and to the world that he was capable of greatness. On the national stage, Elijah Johnson sat in a plush leather chair, his hands gripping the armrests as he stared out of the tinted car window. The towering buildings of Washington, D.C. loomed above him, their grandeur both intimidating and awe-inspiring. He still couldn't believe he was here, heading to the White House. Beside him, Janine adjusted her pearl necklace, her pride almost palpable. She had insisted Elijah wear a suit for the occasion, and though he felt stiff and out of place in the tailored outfit, he knew this moment demanded something more than his usual hoodie and sneakers. "This isn't just about you, baby," Janine said softly, sensing his nerves. "You're carrying a message today, for our community, for all the kids who feel invisible." Elijah nodded, her words sinking deep into his heart. The arrival. When the car pulled up to the White House gates, a throng of reporters stood waiting. Cameras flashed as Elijah and Janine stepped out, the crowd buzzing with questions and shouts of encouragement. "Elijah, how does it feel to be a hero? Do you think this will change how people see you? What do you have to say to those who criticized you?" Elijah felt a surge of anxiety, but Janine gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "Just keep walking, Eli," she whispered. "You don't owe anyone anything right now." As they passed through security and into the grand halls of the White House, Elijah's nerves gave way to awe. The polished floors, the historic paintings, the sheer weight of the building's history, it all felt surreal. In the East Room, a small crowd had gathered for the ceremony. Politicians, educators, and community leaders mingled, their attention turning to Elijah as he entered. The applause that greeted him was overwhelmingness, and Elijah felt his face flush. Standing at the podium was the president, a tall, commanding figure whose smile was both warm and genuine. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president began, his voice resonating through the room, "today we honor a young man who reminds us of the courage and resilience that define our nation." As the president recounted Elijah's bravery, highlighting the moment he tackled one of the attackers and prevented a tragedy, Elijah's mind drifted. He thought about the days leading up to this moment, the doubt, the ridicule, the whispers in the hallways. None of it seemed to matter now. When the president beckoned him to the stage, Elijah took a deep breath and stepped forward. The applause swelled, but all Elijah could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. "Thank you, Mr. President," Elijah said, his voice steady but soft. He glanced at the crowd, then at his mother, who was beaming with pride. I didn't do what I did because I wanted recognition. I did it because I didn't want anyone to get hurt. But if my actions can inspire others to speak up, to stand up for what's right, then I'm grateful for this moment." The room erupted in applause once more, and for the first time, Elijah felt the weight of his actions lifting. The shadows of fame. But not everyone was celebrating Elijah's moment in the spotlight. While social media buzzed with praise, there was an undercurrent of negativity that Elijah couldn't ignore. He's no hero. He just got lucky. Another attempt to make a victim look like a savior. Why does the media keep pushing this narrative? Elijah tried to brush off the hateful comments, but they lingered in his mind like an unwelcome shadow. One evening, as he scrolled through the messages on his phone, he came across a video clip of Ryan Miller being interviewed by a local news station. "Elijah?" Ryan said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Yeah, he tackled that guy or whatever, but let's not act like he's some kind of saint. He's just a kid who got caught in the moment. Honestly, he probably didn't even know what he was doing." Elijah's stomach churned. No matter how much good he did, there would always be people like Ryan who refused to see him for who he was. Finding strength. Janine noticed Elijah's mood shift in the days following the ceremony. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're letting them get to you, aren't you?" she asked gently. Elijah nodded. I thought this would change things, that people would see me differently. But for some of them, it doesn't matter what I do. I'll always just be me." Janine pulled him into a hug. "Listen to me, Eli. The people who matter, they see you for the hero you are. The rest, they're just scared because you're showing them what's possible. Don't let their fear dim your light." Her words stayed with Elijah, and slowly he began to find his footing again. A community united. One day, Elijah received an unexpected visit from Mr. Patel, his history teacher. "Elijah," Mr. Patel said, smiling warmly, "I wanted to show you something." He handed Elijah a stack of letters, handwritten notes from students, parents, and even strangers from across the country. "You've inspired a lot of people," Mr. Patel said. "People who see themselves in you. People who needed to know that they're not alone." Elijah spent hours reading the letters that evening, his heart swelling with a mixture of humility and pride. A message of hope. A few weeks later, Elijah was invited to speak at a community event. Standing on a makeshift stage in the park, surrounded by familiar faces, he felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. "I've learned a lot over these past few weeks," Elijah began, his voice steady, "about courage, about fear, and about what it means to stand up for what's right. But the most important thing I've learned is that we all have a voice, and when we use it, we can change the world, even if it's just one small part of it." The crowd erupted into applause, and Elijah felt a new kind of strength take root within him. A legacy of bravery. As Elijah walked off the stage, Malik met him with a wide grin. "You killed it, man," Malik said, clapping him on the back. Elijah smiled, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be challenges, always people who doubted him. But he also knew he wasn't alone. His actions had sparked something, a movement, a conversation, a sense of hope. And for Elijah, that was more than enough. A legacy of change. The months following Elijah's brave act brought a whirlwind of events, emotions, and reflections. His life, once defined by quiet corridors and silent resilience, now unfolded on a much larger stage. But what Elijah didn't yet realize was that his story would ripple far beyond the walls of Westbridge High School, touching lives and igniting change in ways he could never have imagined. The ripple effect. The letter-writing campaign started innocently enough. After hearing Elijah speak at the community event, a group of students from another high school in the district decided to write letters to their local officials. Their goal was simple: to demand stricter measures to prevent violence in schools. When Elijah learned about the campaign, he was both humbled and inspired. He reached out to the group, offering to help amplify their voices. Before long, more schools joined in, and what began as a small effort turned into a national movement. Elijah became the unofficial face of the campaign, attending rallies and speaking at town halls. At one event, a young girl approached him with tears in her eyes. "Because of you," she said, clutching his hand tightly, "I feel brave enough to speak up now." Her words stayed with Elijah, reminding him of the responsibility he now carried, not just for himself, but for everyone who saw a piece of themselves in his journey. Navigating the shadows. Despite the overwhelming support, the backlash continued. Elijah received messages from those who twisted his story, accusing him of trying to play the hero or questioning the validity of his actions. One particularly harsh comment came from a nationally syndicated columnist who wrote, "This so-called hero is nothing more than a product of the media's obsession with creating stories that tug at the heartstrings. If Elijah Johnson hadn't acted, someone else surely would have." Elijah read the article late one night, the words stinging more than he wanted to admit. For a moment, he questioned everything. Was he truly a hero, or had he just been in the right place at the right time? Janine found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. "Ellie?" she said, sitting down across from him. "What's going on?" He hesitated before showing her the article. Janine read it silently, her expression hardening with each word. "Baby, listen to me," she said, her voice firm. "People will always have something to say, but you're not defined by their words, you're defined by your actions. And no one can take away what you've done." Her unwavering belief in him reunited his own. The White House visit, a full circle moment. Months after the initial recognition ceremony, Elijah received another invitation to the White House, this time to participate in a roundtable discussion on school safety and community building. The meeting included policymakers, educators, and student representatives from across the country. Elijah was the youngest person at the table, but his words carried the weight of experience. "We need more than metal detectors and security guards," he said, his voice steady. "We need to address the root causes, why students feel isolated, why they turn to violence. It's about creating a culture where every student feels seen, heard, and valued." His words resonated deeply, sparking a new wave of discussions and initiatives. A moment of grace. Back in Westbridge, life began to settle into a new normal. Elijah returned to his classes, his quiet demeanor intact despite his newfound fame. Yet he noticed subtle changes around him. Teachers who once overlooked him now greeted him warmly. Students who had previously ignored him sought him out for advice or just to talk. Even Ryan Miller seemed to soften. One afternoon, as they crossed paths in the hallway, Ryan hesitated before speaking. "Hey, Elijah," he said, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. I just wanted to say I was wrong about you. What you did, what you've done, it's impressive." Elijah nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. "Thanks, Ryan," he said simply, understanding that forgiveness wasn't about letting the past go, but about choosing to move forward. One of the most impactful moments came when Elijah was invited to speak at a youth summit in Chicago. Standing before a crowd of young people from diverse backgrounds, he shared his story, not as a tale of heroism, but as a testament to the power of standing up, even when it feels like the world is against you. "Courage isn't about being fearless," he said. "It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. And it's not just about big moments, it's about the small ones too. Listening to someone who feels invisible, standing up for a friend, choosing kindness when it's easier to walk away." After his speech, a young boy approached him, his eyes wide with admiration. "I want to be like you when I grow up," the boy said. Elijah smiled, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "You don't need to be like me," he said. "Just be the best version of you. That's all the world needs." By the time Elijah graduated high school, his story had become a part of the community's fabric. A mural of him tackling the would-be attacker adorned the side of the school building, a reminder to every student who walked through its doors that bravery comes in many forms. Elijah went on to attend college, studying education with the goal of becoming a teacher. He wanted to create classrooms where students felt empowered to speak up and be themselves, places he wished had existed for him growing up. The lesson. Years later, Elijah stood before a classroom of middle schoolers, his eyes scanning the room. He saw pieces of himself in the shy boy in the back, the outspoken girl in the front row, and everyone in between. "Every one of you has a voice," he said, his words filled with conviction. "And when you use it for good, you can change the world, even if it's just one small part of it." The room fell silent, his students hanging on to every word. Elijah Johnson had come full circle, from a quiet, overlooked boy to a symbol of hope and resilience. His story wasn't just about bravery in the face of danger. It was about the power of being seen, the strength in standing up, and the impact one person can have on the world. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content that tackles important issues and promotes positive change. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that matter. Thanks for watching.